Good morning. Some years ago, I was at a meditation retreat somewhere in this area. And the retreat was over the Wesak Festival. And so one of the Sangha members had a cake made, birthday cake for the Buddha. And so she called Hy-Vee and told him what she wanted inscripted. Happy birthday, Buddha. And so she picked up the cake, and it was all wrapped up in a box, and brought it to the retreat and put it in the fridge, waited till the retreat was over. And we had some candles, and we were all going to sit around and sing happy birthday to the Buddha. So the retreat ended, the big moment came. We were all gathered around. We took the lid off of the box, and it said, Happy birthday, Bubba. So we had a great deal of fun talking about how we meditate not only on our Buddha nature, but sometimes on our Bubba nature as well. So it's all part of who we are. The Buddha and the Bubba alike. So this morning, I want to talk about surrender. I want to talk about what I call sweet surrender, as opposed to bitter surrender. So I want to talk about what it is and why it's so very important in this practice, and really in virtually every spiritual practice. And then how to create the climate, the environment for surrender to occur. So let's talk about what it is by first talking about what it is not, just to clarify any misconceptions, which there are a lot around the term surrender. Some folks have a lot of baggage, a lot of strong feelings around that word because of some memories or some associations they may have. So let's unpack it a little bit. Surrender is not giving our personal will over to any other person or any other organization. So that's clearly what it's not. It's not abdicating our power of choice or our willpower to anyone else. It is not resignation. It is not despair. It's not, I feel beaten up. I'm beaten into submission. That's not surrender. That's resignation. That's quitting. But there's still a bitterness. That's a bitter surrender. There's some anger and resentment in that. That's not a sweet surrender. Sweet surrender comes from choice. We cannot be coerced into surrender because it's no longer surrender then. It's simply resignation or giving up. Surrender is always a choice, a conscious choice. And it's not a should, it's not an ought to, it's not something I'm supposed to do, it's simply a choice because we see that it has an effect. And that effect is very beneficial to us as we discover. It's not apathy. It's not just drifting along, unable or unwilling to make any decisions. Where do you want to go for dinner tonight? I don't know, I'm surrendered. What flavor ice cream do you want? I don't know, I'm surrendered. That's not surrender, that's apathy. That's just unwillingness to choose and to take responsibility for our choices. So surrender doesn't mean that we don't make choices. It doesn't mean that we don't take responsibility for our choices. It's not drifting. A metaphor that I sometimes use, I like to canoe, or I used to canoe a lot. I don't as much anymore. But when one canoes, one sooner or later learns to surrender to the river. You know, you can try canoeing upriver. You can do it, but it's a lot of work, and you don't get very far. Or you could go downstream. It's a little bit easier to canoe downstream, to go the same direction the river's going. Or as the old cowboy said, it's easier to ride the horse in the direction that it's going. So, on the other hand, surrender is not just getting in the canoe, throwing the paddles away, and giving oneself over to the river, because you're going to probably get dumped or get stuck, or it's not going to be a very pleasant journey. So, surrender is not advocating our willpower, but it's not pushing the river. It's not trying to go upstream either. So, surrender is an internal non-resistance. It is non-resisting our internal experiences. And again, the word is internal experiences, our personal experiences. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean non-resistance to anything that happens outside of us. You know, we still have the power of saying no. You know, if it's raining, non-resistance doesn't mean standing in the rain waiting for it to end. You know, you can come indoors, or you can get an umbrella. Surrender is not being attached to any particular outcome. It doesn't mean not having a goal. It doesn't mean giving up all goals. It doesn't mean giving up all desires. It means not being attached to any particular outcome. So one can desire something, but there's no fixation on how that has to look. See, that's where the personal will comes in. We think it has to look a certain way, or feel a certain way, or unfold in a certain pattern. We don't know how that's going to happen. But it doesn't mean that we don't have desires, because desire is part of who we are. It's any animal has desire. Every human has desires. We're born with desires. And we probably die with desires. Okay? So it's not about trying to give up desire, but it's about letting go of being attached to how that desire needs to be filled specifically. It's not efforting or striving. And what I mean by efforting is by trying to make something happen. Again, it's kind of like in the canoeing metaphor. It's not going upstream. It's not trying to fight the current. And yet it is consciously aligning the canoe with the mainstream current. And when we do that, it's more fun. We get down the river faster. We get down the river drier, usually. And but it does require some skill, you see. And so surrender requires some skill. It doesn't mean just going mindless and turning our life over to something else. There's a beautiful world religion called Taoism. And in Taoism, the Tao, D-A-O, T-A-O, it's actually spelled typically, but it's pronounced Tao. And the Tao is kind of like what we might call God, only the Tao is a verb. It's not a noun. It's not a thing. It's not a person. It's a movement. It's a flow. It's an activity. It is the creative force of the universe. It's the creative intelligence of the universe and of all life. And so I like the word Tao, and when I think of the word God, I think of God as a verb, not as a noun. But God has some charged meaning to some people, and they think of God as a person. I think of God as an activity. But whatever word works for you, it's the flow of life. Surrendering to life itself. Surrendering to your true nature or the Buddha nature. Whatever you want to call it. Surrendering to the Dharma. You know, the Dharma, one of the meanings of the Dharma is the way, W-A-Y, which interestingly is the same thing that the Tao typically means, is the way with a capital W. So it's the way of the universe. It's a way of life. It's a way of nature. So let's talk about why. Why should I surrender? It doesn't seem to be the American way of life or the Western way of life. It doesn't seem to be in concert with the way most people live. So let's talk about it. Surrender is actually at the heart of all spiritual practice. I mean, when we really look at what is a spiritual practice, it means giving up our own egoic fixations on who we are and what our life is supposed to look like, and letting go of that in deference to something greater. And again, Christians would call it God, but you could call it Allah, you could call it the law, God's law, the Lord, whatever, Yahweh. Surrendering softens the ego. Surrendering eventually will melt the ego. So the ego doesn't go away. I mean, the ego is still available to us to go to work and drive our cars and function in the world. But like our cars and like our offices at work, hopefully we don't live there. Hopefully we have a life separate from that. And so we recognize the ego has its place, but that's not where we live. Thank you, sir. Hello. Mara sneaks in there every once in a while and drains the batteries. So, spiritual practice, true spiritual practice, I'm not talking about necessarily religious practice, but spiritual practice, tends to dissolve the ego or to soften the ego so that our identification is not tied to the ego. We're identified with something bigger, with life itself. Not just the canoe, but the whole river. Surrender allows us to become what we really are. We think we are this body. We think we are this mind or this image of ourself or whatever our personal history is. That's who we typically call me. Surrender allows us to let go of that little me and become what we really are. And there's really no word for that. Again, we can call it the Buddha nature or the divine nature or true nature or whatever you want to call it, but it's something infinitely bigger than our tiny little ego is. And you will discover that your life has a life of its own. We typically think of my life, that I'm living my life. And that's not true. Life is being lived through you. And when we're identified with the ego, the life energy is constricted to a very narrow passage. It's like trying to canoe in 2 inches of water. It gets bumpy. That's what dukkha is called. When the bottom of the canoe hits the gravel bottom of the river or the rock. So surrender is becoming what we really are. We're surrendering to ourselves, in a sense. We're surrendering to our true nature. So let's talk about how to do it. And I'll begin with another story. This one is maybe not quite so true, but it's a great story anyway. About a traveler that was driving through the countryside and found himself hopelessly lost. And fortunately, he saw a farmer out cutting his front lawn, and he stopped and waved the farmer over, and the farmer came over and he says, yeah, what can I do for you? And the traveler says, I'm trying to find Jonesville, and I'm lost. How do I get to Jonesville? And the farmer thought for a minute. He looked one way, and then he looked the other way, and he says, well, sir, I don't think you can get there from here. If I were you, I'd start from somewhere else. So that's my response to how to surrender. It's the wrong question to ask, because we can't make ourselves surrender. Because surrender is a little bit like going to sleep. We can't make ourselves go to sleep. But we can create the intention to go to sleep, and we can create the conditions for sleep, okay? And those may vary from person to person, but we turn out the lights and we go to bed or whatever it is we do. We relax. But we can't will ourselves into sleeping any more than we can will ourselves into surrendering. But we can be willing. We can create the intention. So that's the first step, is I'm willing to surrender. When we're willing to surrender, what happens? Do we surrender? Boom, just like that? No, we become aware of all sorts of resistance, right? All those parts of ourselves that want to paddle upstream, or they want to hold on to that branch. Have you ever tried that when you're in a canoe? You grab a branch? You know what happens if you have. Yeah, you get nice and wet. And the canoe's usually ahead of you down the river. So it's about becoming aware of how we hold on to. So when we say let go, we become aware of all the places that are holding on. And then here's where the paradox comes in, and this is where the Dharma practice comes in. Recognizing the places where we're holding on, recognizing the places where we're resisting the flow, and then doing nothing but recognizing them, letting it be. And as we bring awareness to resistance, it dissolves. We don't have a whole lot of time left, but sometimes I'll do an experiment. I'll do this at home. We don't have time to do it here. But hold your fist real tight sometime for a long period of time. And then distract yourself. See how long you can do it. And then bring awareness to your fist and see how long you can do it. When we become fully aware of holding that fist, what happens? Eventually, the hand gets very tired, very sore, and we don't have to talk ourselves into surrender. It just becomes automatic. It's like, yeah, it's our natural way of being. But when we don't know that we're holding on, when we don't know that we're grasping, we can do that for lifetimes. And it's not going to go away automatically, you see. Awareness is the key. Awareness, non-resistance of the resistance. Staying in the present moment. Not focusing on the past or the future. Resistance comes in two flavors, typically. One is craving. Craving is wanting something that's not here. You know, I want to look better, feel better. I want more, whatever. I want somebody to change. I want me to change. I want. Being attached to that outcome. Not just having the desire, but the attachment, the demand that it happen. Or resistance can come with a pushing away, which is more of a judgment or tension or aversion. Those are the two primary forms of resistance. They can take lots of subtle subcategories. So being aware of resistance, being willing to surrender, being aware of resistance when we do, being willing to let go and surrender to who you really are, to your Buddha nature. Being willing to let go of the Bubba nature and let the Buddha nature take over. So surrender really brings, true surrender brings a deep, deep sense of peace and a deep sense of trust in life itself and an ability to relax deeply into life. That's what surrender is. If we look at a newborn child, a newborn baby, total surrender, you see. They're not worried about somebody's not going to hold them properly. They just trust whoever's holding them. They just trust life until they're taught otherwise. But we're trusting life is natural. Surrender is a natural way of being. So I want to close with this quote from the Tao Te Ching. The Tao of heaven does not strive, and yet it overcomes. It does not speak, yet it is answered. It does not ask, yet it is always supplied with every need. It seems at ease, and yet it follows a plan. So it is with your life. Live at ease, surrender, find peace, and become who you really are. Thank you for sharing your practice with us this morning.